Hello and welcome to the February NMSS Reassembly Tournament. This one's a standard format, nothing special going on here. But first things first, I would like to mention that we have an unusually large number of first-time competitors here. We have 7 first-time submissions, 4 of which you see on your screen here. So this will be the hybrid format that we started using a little bit ago. So there will be 7 small subpools of 3 to 4 ships, and then that will culminate in a double elimination bracket. Because of the number of first-time competitors, we actually have 2 neophyte pools, this being the first one. So let's go ahead and get this one started. So up first we have Striker against Death Not Taxes. Death Not Taxes we actually saw in the raid boss fight as well, but because this is his first tournament, and the raid boss didn't really count as a tournament, we're going to give it a go. One interesting thing we see here, this very narrow band, the point here is for this entire front section to break off, and for this back section to then become a kiter, which could be very interesting. Multi-stage ships are pretty hard to get working, but it should be neat if it pans out well. In the meantime though, you see torpedoes, lasers, pretty standard weapons, reliable sources of damage. Little drone ship, and I think that's all the designs for his fleet. On the other side we have the Vex Purging Protocol after that shooter game that has not been well received in its latest iteration. This here is a farmer fleet, which is a brave move. The farmer cannons and farmer missiles are nice, but you can see these are med beams, and med beams are not particularly cost efficient. We'll see how they work out, but I do feel like the Vex are going to get purged rather than do the purging. We are seeing some long range weapons here though. I can never... The farmer EXR1 railguns and longbows are the same shape, which is frustrating. But let's see how it goes. And you can see right off the bat the Death Fleet is scoring a lot of points. The lasers are very short ranged, and it might not seem like much, but each one of them I think does 100 DPS, and I think he's got a solid like 20 or 30 on the front of each of his ships. They're very cheap. Their only real drawback is that they have almost no range, and that they are very heavy, so you have to spend a lot trying to just get them moving. And you can see the large blocker style ships doing their job very well, keeping the small drone ships safe. I think the drones are going to be fast enough to catch up to the kiters, but the kiters have some point defense. But I don't think the kiters are going to be able to put up enough points on the board to make up the gap. We'll give them a chance though. Death Not Taxes is a relatively new guy. This is his first standard format tournament. He was in the raid battle beforehand, but he's a new guy, and I feel like he's been spending some time looking at the archive. His ships have not been his ships are not your standard fare for a new participant. And getting stuck up on the wall is the bane of the existence of all kiters. We're seeing it happen a little bit on both sides, but the kiters from the Death Fleet are much faster and more nimble, making it pretty easy for them to evade. Those lasers are earning their keep though. And one of the 2 kiters for the Vex Purging Protocol are down, and the massive drone cloud erupting through. Oh, also another thing I forgot to mention, because I am brilliant, is you may notice that the reassembly audio has changed a bit. The music is not your standard reassembly music. It's actually from the game Homeworld, Deserts of Kharak, which is an excellent game and I highly recommend it. But Death Fleet takes round 1. Yeah, a lot of people, their first submission is shields and guns. And I think quite a few people get discouraged because the shields and guns strategy doesn't perform to expectations. But those that stick around generally shift to armor pretty quickly. Yeah, this is a really solid first submission. I don't know that it's quite Hammer and Anvil or whatever it was called territory, but this is a really solid first actual submission from Death Not Taxes. Hammer and tongs, that's it. Yes, Popper. There you go, take a nap. You're pretty when you're quiet. Yeah, I'm really interested to see how the multi-stage facet of Death Fleet ends up panning out. I think it might work, but because most incoming fire is going to end up coming from the front of the ship, I'm not entirely sure that it'll break off quite right. Although really, because it's a very thin seam all the way around, you just have to break the seam anywhere. So it might work out. Yeah, on the core pod, there are quite a few. Like, relative to the mass, the bulk of its thrust is actually coming from the little core pod. So it is a multi-stage ship, and I'm looking forward to seeing it go to stage 2 and see what happens. Because stage 2 is like all missiles. Or well, no, I think he's got a... Does he have a bunch of point defense on it? Yeah, he has some point defense cannons on it. That might throw things off, but we'll see. We'll see. With a little luck, he tested it and it works. Or maybe he didn't test it and it fails miserably. It'll be interesting. Either way. Yeah, also true. The pod may grind itself a bit, trying to escape. But either way, two-stage ships are not something we generally see from first-time competitors. Very promising from Death Fleet. And Death Not Taxes takes the match. So up next we have Rico against Striker. Richter, you can see, has instead opted for a Terran fleet. He's using some shields on these guys, but the bulk of his defense looks to be armor. Proton swords, always a good choice. Mortars, always a questionable choice. Some big plasmas. These ships are going to deal a shitload of damage if they get close enough to the enemy. And railguns. Or no, yeah, there are railguns and plasmas on that. Okay. This should be pretty interesting. And also, a bonus point. I think Richter, Rico, and Striker might be friends in real life. So I think this is going to set up a grudge match. And unfortunately, we're seeing the fragility of the farmer ships combined with their lack of thrust to weight ratio. This is really no fault of strikers, other than choosing to go farmer. But a lot of people fall for the farmer trap the first time through. Farmers are super easy in the campaign because they generate infinite resources, but resources don't really apply in a tournament environment. The fights are too fast, too aggressive, and generally return resources off since it essentially just doubles fleet budgets. And Rico takes the match. And next up we have Margo, who's been on Discord for a while and was interested in showing his mettle here. These are antimatter kiters with a variety of point defense, a few missiles. But we gotta have a talk about how you name your fleets, I think. The Alpha coming in very handy against the relatively fragile farmer ships. Farmers have some of the best shields in the game, but shields in general have proven underwhelming in the past. The level of disrespect coming out of these kiters, though, is not promising. They might be better off later on. One of the problems it might be encountering is that farmer missiles are actually rather long range, and there are plenty of long range weapons on Striker's fleet. So it might just be assuming that since it doesn't have the range advantage, it's just closing into point blank to fight. But we will see. And Margo takes the match. Tough run for Striker, but I do say welcome to the Crucible for a reason. And now we've got Goblin Squadron up against Death Fleet. And Death Fleet, I'm feeling, has the advantage here. I think Goblin Squadron will probably put out more damage, but the magnitude's greater health of Death Fleet will, I think, prevail. Especially since Death Fleet is bringing torpedoes. I love torpedoes. And you can see the scoreboard kind of reflecting it. The big thing is it's generally more efficient to buy health because of the mobility rules. Every block's mass sort of adds cost because you have to include enough thrust to move it. And more or less, it's generally more efficient to hover near the minimum speed requirement unless you're building a kiter or a rusher. And Rico's team we've seen is full up on rushers, and they definitely closed the gap, and you saw what they did to the actual kiters. But I don't know that Rico's going to have the oomph to actually kill these big ships. I think the big ships are probably going to win this one for Death Not Taxes. And we're seeing just a couple ships left for the Goblin Squadron. And as fast as the Russians are, you can see the Goblin Squadron's drone ships are even faster. Though the drones are having a hard time keeping up with the rushers. But that can't happen. Terran drones are rather slow moving, but they live forever, so they'll have a lot of range. They just have a hard time keeping up with fast moving targets. That said though, those large ships for Death Knot taxes really can't get up to speed. And D&T takes round 1. And this initial volley of torpedoes could be very lethal. You can see a few very close passes. Torpedoes hit as hard as antimatters for anyone who's not terribly familiar with the game. And they have, I think, the same splash radius and the same damage, but a lower rate of fire and like 1/9 the cost. However, they have a slower projectile velocity and you can counter them with point defense, unlike the antimatters. But overall, personally I prefer the torpedoes to the antimatters. And yeah, Richter, the thing about speed is that speed is of great utility, but it only helps when you can either keep out of range of the enemy, or if you have to close into range with an enemy that has more than you do. When it comes to raw brawling power, hit points is more useful than speed in most cases. And that's kind of what we're seeing, is those large orbs from D&T, or they just have the hit points to absorb everything and win by attrition. I like Labs championing the non-meta scene, but this might be the most meta fleet that he's submitted. I think he's got the Feralder Stubnose in here. Hey man, don't be ashamed. Everybody likes to win from time to time, you know? Nothing wrong with that. No, Floof. Your ships are gorgeous, but Alfeathers is here too, and that is some stiff competition. I thought not. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. This little railgun ship go. It's trying. And D&T takes the match. So next up we have D&T against Margo. I don't think the antimatters are going to be able to pop those big guys. That's just... I don't think they're going to have the damage. However, as you see, the little drone ships are screwed. Or I might be wrong. Who knows? Who knows? With the way disrespect works in this game, and some of the interesting decisions the AI likes to make, in theory, Margo's ships should have no problem keeping distance on those large ones, and applying damage safely and cutting through them with the antimatter cannons. He has 16 antimatter cannons on the field. But, as you can see, this is not long range. This is not long range at all. Yeah, I think one of the bigger problems he might have is that he has a lot of close-range weapons on his ship. They have like 3 or 4 flak cannons and several defense cannons on each one, or something like that. And as a result, when it averages out the DPS, it figures that it's a close-range ship. So if we look here, we should be able to see. Yeah, 4 defense cannons and 4 flak cannons, something like that on each of them. And as a result, the bulk of their damage is defense cannon range, rather than antimatter range, since antimatters actually don't do that much damage per second. But the 2 of the defense cannons will easily put to shame, or the 4 defense cannons will easily put to shame the DPS of the 4 or the 2 antimatters. And yeah, the defense cannons, I actually don't really like using defense cannons as point defense, but I do like using them as ship-to-ship primary damage sources for very close-range combat. They're just so cheap and you get so much damage out of them. And they take up no space at all. And it looks like we're going to see DNT take round 2 as well, which will give DNT a 3-0 run in the Subpool. So he gets to go to the champion bracket. And now we have Richter up against Margo. And we saw before, Richter's engage speed is very high, and that might pose an issue for these kiters, but the relatively small size of the ships also kind of makes them very vulnerable to the antimatters. But as you can see on the scoreboard, it does appear to be going in Richter's favor slightly. We'll see. Margo's ships are still showing some disrespect behavior, especially against some of the smaller guys. The other real big problem with antimatters is because they're so expensive, the ships that rely on antimatters tend to show a lot of disrespect anyway. There's a ratio, it's something like 25% or 50% or something like that. If the enemy ship's cost is a lower ratio than relative to your own cost, then the ship will just assume that it can run in real quick and kill them, which is not necessarily the case. That kind of decision was made to make the campaign more bearable, but it causes very negative effects on tournaments, unfortunately. And have a good night, Husk. Margo is swinging this one back, though. Or at least trying to, but with so few ships left, one or two mistakes by the AI might just seal this one. Antimatter gangbang. And that's round 1 in favor of Margo. A pretty close match, though. That one very easily could have gone either way. You can see Margo taking some early losses this time that he did not have last round. And I think at this point, Richter and Margo both have one win. So depending on how many we get in the champion pool, one of these two might just, or depending on how many we get in the champion bracket, we might just get one of these two in the champion bracket as well. But we'll have to see. I want the champion bracket to be somewhat padded out, but that all depends, because in the event of a tie for first, then everyone tied gets to go through. And some of the pools, sometimes we'll get two or three people tied. Not trying to be here all day. Hello, Grand Scheme. And yeah, proton beams are generally considered an underwhelming weapon. They look good on paper, but their uptime is so low that they're never going to do what it says they're going to do. The background music is from Homeworld Deserts of Kharak. It's a really good game, you should check it out if you haven't already. And Margo takes the match, which gives Margo the second place in the pool. And thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.